Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining in for today's session. We are looking at Learning Outcome 2 in particular today with the unit that we've been covering with regards to, develop and prepare resources, which is quite an interesting unit for me because I do most of the work, in terms of preparing and teaching and preparing the teaching resources for a lot of different courses at UK Versity. So I can relate to this unit quite brilliantly. So what we've done in the first learning outcome is primarily if I have to do just a bit of a quick recap, what we've done is in the first learning outcome, we've covered understanding the principles which underpin development and obviously the preparation of resources. So when you look at this particular aspect of underpinning, the resources which are required for the process which is required for essentially developing the resources, what we are looking at in this case is primarily understanding the aspects of how you are going to go about developing resources which are going to meet the needs of the learners. So in this case we are looking at resource couple of aspects of what we would want to essentially look at would be to say, for example, when I look at developing the resources, I will look at what are the learners' needs and requirements. I'd essentially be focused on understanding what are the key curriculum requirements. I'll be looking at understanding awarding body or regulators' requirements, some legislations in particular. I'll also look at the criteria, eligibility criteria for some of the learners who are going to be studying the qualification. And then what I'm going to be doing is basically looking at some of the instructional models that will be used, to create these resources. So when we look at the instructional models, I'm talking about the AD model, which is analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation model. I look at the Bloom's taxonomy. I look at Wojcicki's social constructivism, theory model. And last but not the least, the universal design for learning model, which basically is focused on use of technology and the assessment and evaluation process in terms of ensuring that the material which is provided by the lecturers, educators, teachers, let's put it this way, instructors, is all fit for purpose. Now, there are lots of different methods through which we will be looking at evaluation, and evaluation tends to follow the route of assessments in education, and assessments can be of different types. As I mentioned earlier, there are 15 or 16 different types of assessment methods, but the common ones being formative and summative assessment, wherein formative means ongoing and summative means, an assessment or a decision or a grade that is awarded towards the end of the learners completing a module, completing a unit, or completing a particular term. Now, the most important part in terms of underpinning the principles for development is to look at preparing resources which are fit for purpose, which are, taking into account various requirements of learners, both from a point of view of the teaching and learning, but also from a point of view of instructional design. And that is where we'll also look at some of the theoretical models, which we covered in Learning Outcome 1, including, what are the key models? And those models were social constructivism model of Wojcicki, wherein he's proposed that learning is social, and the context of how teachers should prepare the material should be done in a way which promotes this participation, inclusive learning, and obviously the involvement from the learner. And then we also look at, the second model, which is Bloom's taxonomy, which is a framework which is very well accepted, the six layers of the pyramid. And the idea there is when we look at key stage 1, key stage 2, key stage 3, and some of the other terminology, when you look at education in particular, whether it's, primary, secondary, or further or higher education, you are going to look at helping the learners build that, let's say skills which would then allow them to remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and also then put it to practice. That means they would like to create or go into the objectivity of higher level thinking skills, where they're interested in more creating, experimenting with new ideas. And that is where you would be looking at developing these resources which are meeting the requirements of the learners. Now, in addition to this, what we are also focused on in the Learning Outcome 2 in this unit is to be able to develop resources that meet the requirements and needs of our learners. So here, The first one was the first learning outcome that we've covered in detail, and the presentation basically tends to look at, talking about the principles. How do we look at development, and what are the key bits of legislation, regulation that we need to keep in mind to be able to develop resources adequately, which are fit for purpose. And then we looked at one of the major things, which is the role of technology in the development of these resources, and how the technology has come to the aid or help of educators in particular, wherein the integration of technology in learning resources is now considered essential, especially in the digital age. So when we do talk about the integration of technology, what we've covered in that is the SAMA model, which is SAMR model, which is substitution, augmentation, modification, and redefinition. And this helps educators integrate technology in a way that enhances and transforms learning experiences. Now, we also looked at the TPAC model or the framework, and the TPAC model or the framework typically falls back onto the traditional pedagogical approaches, wherein the technological, pedagogical, content, knowledge framework, as it is now termed as, highlights the interplay between technology, the pedagogy, and the content, knowledge, and the guidance the educators, teachers, instructors, lecturers, tutors provide for learners, and how they develop these resources with the use of technology, and use technology to teach and deliver in the classroom in a way which becomes effective, inclusive, and engaging with the learners, is that TPAC framework that we also need to keep in mind. Now, in the second learning outcome, just very briefly, obviously there are 5 assessment criteria, and this particular learning outcome focuses on being able to develop. That means we would need to practically show what resources we are putting together, how do we put them together, and we'll basically need to go through that process of putting it into practice by showing practical applications, or the essence of essentially bringing evidence into the work at a later stage for the assignment, and that would be be able to develop resources to meet learning needs. Now here we are going to start with talking about first need analysis, and what is the analysis which the teacher, educator, instructor, lecturer, whichever way you call them. I would say teachers essentially use to check on the learners and their ability to learn in a particular session, and that would be termed as what is called the process of ensuring that we are able to engage with the learners. We are able to use some of the instructional design principles and technological tools to understand what are the learners' requirement. And when we look at in detail the learner's requirement, we need to conduct what is called a needs analysis, and that is what we look at. The second thing that we will look at in this learning outcome is how do we design resources. So we go into a bit of a, if you wear the hat of, that you're looking at now, designing or preparing resources, you would at some stage go through by creating a bit of a blueprint. And that blueprint tends to be, a program handbook or a course handbook, which will essentially cover most of the details of, the unit or the course which is being, prepared or designed. So this phase would essentially be the design phase. And then in the design phase, we'll be looking at the key instructional strategies, story writing, scripting, and obviously meeting the key grade descriptors or the standards which are required for us to include and map to, say the regulator, in this case Ofcall, or for example, Ofsted, and look at making sure that all the essential regulation and legislation bit is covered in the design phase, while looking at creating a blueprint for the designing or creating of that qualification of the course content, for a unit, even on a longer term or a long-term basis on the course. We look at developmental phase, we look at implementation phase, and then we look at finally the evaluation phase. In evaluation phase, you look at designing the assignment briefs, the assessment methods, and what will the learners be going through in terms of checking on the learning that they've had in that particular course. And in this case, one of the key examples that I look at doing essentially is that when we look at Moodle, the system that you have access to, and in our case, that tends to be the main system for teaching and learning, and you get access to, in that particular system, what you're looking at is we use all this particular, key elements or key, let's say, the phases that we go through when we look at, obviously designing the system, which would then provide the teaching and learning material. So the technology is looking at providing delivery, but the creation of the material tends to be done on the basis of course handbook, program handbooks, chief examiner reports, which are given or provided by different providers. In the case of NCFE, we have, the report for the chief examiner. There's a course handbook available. There is a learning sector skill council report, which basically emphasizes inputs from employers. All those bits are taken into account while designing the course material to ensure that the course and the indicative content in the course and the units that you study is fit for purpose. Now, some of the bits that you can directly relate to is the fact that we talk about the indicative content. So when we look at a particular unit, and in that unit, what is to be taught as a teacher, if I have to teach this particular unit, what is it that I'm teaching? What is it that I'm actually delivering? That is prepared as the content or the material which is required to be studied by learners. And that preparation of that material is done by the teachers. And where does that come in? How do we decide that material is optimum or is fit for purpose for that unit? That is decided in the design phase, to look at the requirements from employers, look at the requirement from the market, in particular the key legislators. So in this case, the Department for Education, the learning sector skill councils, and then we also look at employers' inputs to ensure that the qualification or the course which has been studied by the learners helps them in developing appropriate skills, and also gives them the knowledge to be able to use in their day-to-day work or in their operations on the day-to-day learning. So this bit is what we are going to be looking at. And when we look at the example of the e-learning and Moodle system, this technology is, as I mentioned, is a conduit, and it is used to teach and deliver. But the creation of that material, which is done on the basis of need analysis, design phase. We look at developmental phase, implementation phase, evaluation phase, and then we put together this qualification, which will undergo some sort of rigorous quality checks to ensure that it meets the criteria. And once it is approved by the regulator, say in this case Ofqual, then the qualification is then launched by the awarding organization, or in some cases, various other organizations. So in order to discuss this in a bit more detail, what we're going to look at is go through some slides in which we will cover, in a bit more, depth of what this learning outcome expects us to go through. And what I would do is shift you over to the slides so that we can do a bit of discussion on the basis of, what we are looking at covering in learning outcome 2. So as you can see, as I mentioned to you, slightly different words which are given in the indicative content. So here we are looking at agreeing first on the resources need. We're looking at preparing resources. We're looking at preparing resources and adapting them to a particular course, or a set of learners or cohort that we are going to deliver it to. And then we provide guidance to practitioners in terms of how these resources are to be used. And then we also look at giving them a bit of advice and guidance on what is the suitability of these resources, and in what places you would need to augment, create, contextualize, and in some cases, bring in best case or best practice case studies from similar disciplines to be able to, look at delivery in order to fulfill and meet the requirements of the course, or in this case, the unit. Now, what we also want to look at is, as I mentioned to you, just as a bit of a brief outline, is that when we look at developing resources, one of the key things that I have in mind is what would be the optimum ways in which my learners would be able to essentially understand and use those resources. So in terms of the resources that we develop, say, for example, for this unit, just as a case in point, we've got a PowerPoint presentation, we've got some ebooks, we've got some handouts, we've got one or two journal articles which essentially talk about and give a context of how you could develop and prepare resources for learning and development. And then we've also got some templates which the learners can essentially use for the purposes of, understanding and using that this is how this would be done. Now, if I give you a bit of a overview in terms of, say, let's look at if I were to develop the resources for a particular course like strategic management. Now, as a teacher, what I would look at is pick up the course handbook, which is obviously a handbook or a course material which is provided by the awarding organization. After I've looked at the course handbook, what I would do is go through in detail in understanding the units, unit structure, the breakdown, the number of credits for each of the units, and what are the expected learning outcomes which the learners are going to go through in each of these units in the course. Now, if I filter it down to just one particular unit, so if I look at strategic leadership, there are, say, for example, the unit, look at the unit, look at the grading criteria for the unit, look at the credits for the unit, and then within that, look at the assessment grid, which is designed by the awarding organization, and it gives me a good indication that there are 4 learning outcomes. In each of the learning outcomes, there are 2 or 3 assessment criteria. And then towards the the end of the document, the awarding body also provides the details of what is expected to be covered in the unit, and that is given across as an indicative content. Now, this process that I go through is broken down in several stages before even I consider delivery of that particular unit to my learners. So in such cases, when I look at identifying, when I look at, say, for example, consider delivery of this particular unit to my learners, what I would need to then start to look at would be some aspects of, say, number one, looking at needs analysis. And then there is where I will go into details of understanding what are the key requirements of learners, what are their existing skill sets, what is their knowledge. And sometimes as teachers, educators, we end up asking on a scale of 1 to 10, can you rank yourself in terms of what is the knowledge that you have on this particular subject? It could involve, sometimes starting off with icebreaker sessions, things like asking a lot of questions, going into details of what the learners have previously covered in qualifications in their experience, and then also reviewing some of the data which is available to you as a teacher, about your learners or about the students who have actually enrolled in that program. Now, before you start, what you're also going to do is basically define some of the, learning objectives, for your learners. So these learning objectives tend to be defined in a SMART way. That means they're specific, they are measurable, they are achievable, they're realistic, and they are time bound. Because you're not going to be teaching that unit across the year, you're going to teach that unit for about 6 to 8 weeks, and the idea is within those weeks, you look at the guided learning hours, you look at the total qualification time, you look at the learning outcomes and the content that you're covering, and you also see whether there are enough when you say enough resources. What I would do is rephrase that, and I'll say whether the teacher has created enough resources to be shared with learners to explain and provide them knowledge about that particular content, and that would be defined in the learning objectives. Then we look at designing the learning resource. You would choose an appropriate format. So in our case, if we look at online delivery, as you can see, most of the material that we provide typically tends to be a PowerPoint presentation. Some of these presentations have a combination of videos, and in some cases, we also then towards the end also suggest further reading, and that further reading can be done through the integrated ebooks, articles and journals, and in some cases, case studies. And those tend to be the learning resources that we put together for most of the courses, because they are going to be suitable, they are going to be relevant, and they are going to be able to meet the requirements of the learners in order for them to be able to grasp the knowledge related to the content. Now, one of the other things that we also look at very clearly in terms of development of the content is, in terms of teaching and learning, is developing the content. The content that we develop has to be, easy enough for the learners to understand. It has to be non-ambiguous. It has to have practical examples or real-world examples, as we would say, so that there is a balance between the theory part and also the practical application part. And in some cases, to augment this and to augment the learning side of things, sometimes we have to use we bring in the use of technology, and that use of technology typically tends to be through the medium of, say, for example, videos, showing, for example, videos about related topics. In some cases, it tends to be quizzes using Kahoot, or in some cases, what you would also do is, if it's in a classroom-based setting, you would primarily be looking at building up activities which will essentially allow you to deliver the content. And these activities could be group discussion, group activities, role plays. It could be activities which are designed, for a classroom-based setting, and they would engage and involve learners in terms of, teaching and learning of the content. Then, as I mentioned, integration of technology, which is now in the digital age quite important. And what we do get to see is a learner management system. In our case, is something that we put in place, and this system acts as a central repository both for the learners as well as teachers, to be able to provide all the teaching and learning material in one place, and that is easily accessible across different platforms, whether it's PC, Mac, tablet, or mobile. Then even before this is launched, what we then tend to do is we need to be able to essentially, look at making sure that the content that has been created is fit for purpose. So there's a pilot phase which is it goes through, and in some cases, sometimes when we do the first teach of courses, it tends to be that we will look at chopping and changing some part of the content in the material, because we feel that as we designed it did not meet the requirements, and sometimes you have to go and adapt the teaching and learning material to meet the requirements of the learner. You collect feedback, you analyze that feedback to say whether that is meeting the criteria, whether it is making the difference in terms of learner being able to pick up the knowledge, and that is where you would look at piloting and reviewing. And then the final phase is the implementation, where you do a full-scale implementation, and then ongoing evaluations tend to happen. Now, ongoing evaluations tend to, in the teaching side, I would say, tend to happen through peer observations, teaching observations, and those are basically evaluations for tutors, teachers, educators, instructors. But when we look at evaluating, because we're talking about resources here, so we don't need to go into the assessment side of things. But generally speaking, this evaluation tends to take root of, evaluating the teachers who are essentially teaching and delivering the material. So I hope this helps you understand overarchingly the learning outcome too, which is be able to develop resources to meet the learning and development needs. Now, if I take a practical example in terms of, understanding what are the learning and development needs, say, for example, of an individual, and we put Bloom's taxonomy to it, or apply some sort of, instructional design model to it, what we are going to find is that in some cases, when we look at adapting the resources to meet the needs of the learners, sometimes what you do is you look at, say, for example, specific needs of learners, which could be, they might have some sort of disability, they might have some sort of extra, need, which is to ensure that they are able to get on and obviously understand what is being taught. And this could be by helping them, providing additional information, advice, and guidance, and in some cases even appropriately providing the material which would be more useful for them, as given as printed handouts, or material which is given to them for the purposes of self-study. Now, having sometimes resources which are required and available to ensure that the teaching is effective, it could be that you have a combination of resources, which could be textbooks, which could be, say, for example, multimedia applications related to the course that you're teaching. You have digital resources, which include video, text, websites, animated videos, and in some cases, lectures or pre-recorded lectures like we have it in our case. So I hope this bit in terms of how do we develop the resources to meet the requirements and needs of the learners is clear. Now we get into the first assessment criteria, and here what we are looking at is we need to look at the whole ecosystem. So if you're working within a college or a school or say a educational institution, you look at who are the key stakeholders who are going to be involved in teaching and developing of those teaching and learning process. And within that teaching and learning process, there'll be individuals which will be involved primarily in the development of resources. So you identify what are the key stakeholders, and you need to then agree the goals which are primarily required for ensuring that the needs of learners for whom you're preparing the resources are essentially meeting the requirements. So you're agreeing in particular to be able to ensure that it meets the requirements of your learners. So again, we go back to the fact that you identify learners' needs. That could be done through diagnostics, initial assessments. It could be also done through looking at analyzing any barriers which are there for education. So these barriers could be which could be impacting the learning side of things, for the learner, and those barriers could be seen as social, cultural, institutional barriers, or personal factors. In some cases, they would need to be looked at from a teacher's perspective, and you would need to address these to ensure that there is inclusivity and accessibility to resources across all the learners who are taking a particular course or studying a particular course. And then you also look at reviewing the legal and ethical considerations, which could ensure that resources are compliant with the educational standards. So in this case, they are fit for purpose, they are meeting the requirements of Department of Education, or the off call in this case. And then there is a continuous evaluation which tends to happen, for these resources when they need to be adjusted, changed, amended, or updated, because the learners' needs are evolving. That means the learners that you have, no two learners are similar. So obviously, depending on what cohort, what batch of learners you have inherited or are starting off with, at some stage, what you're also going to be looking at is updating and maintaining the relevance of these resources, so that they are effective in terms of providing teaching and learning. A simple example that I would give you is like in the case of universities and further in higher education, when you look at referencing, what we do recommend our learners is that they should reference only material from the last 10 years. Anything over the period of 10 years, apart from theoretical frameworks or models, might be, I wouldn't say obsolete, but there would have been further updates to those models. And that is why referencing tends to be within a time frame of the last 10 years. So in this case, when you agree with the needs of the learners and what resources need to be developed, you start with diagnostics, initial assessment, which is basically conducting, needs analysis. Then you engage with different stakeholders, and they in a school could be a teaching assistant, different teachers, your program manager or your course leader, or in some cases the head teacher, and they would be working with you to provide perspective on the key legislations and regulations, the key requirements of the curriculum, and also the key standards which have to be incorporated in ensuring that the resources that you have are fit for purpose. Then you obviously go through that same process of analyzing and synthesizing data, documentation, and communication need. That means if anything which has changed, or say, for example, towards the end of the term, what happens in most schools is that the school typically tends to have what is called the parent-teacher meetings. And these parent-teacher meetings are, going to be informing uh, parents as stakeholders that what is their children's achievement or performance in this particular term. Now, that is where the need for identification of stakeholders is there. That is where the need of analysis is there. That is where the need of communication tends to come in, is because you then have a meeting with the parents to discuss any specific gap in skills or any specific areas wherein they need further attention or due attention to be able to come up to a particular standard which is defined, for that particular year or the class. So, for example, when you look at key stage 3, there are knowledge, skills, habits, and attitude. And this is what generally, schools look at when they look at producing a report for the learners. So they will, give a rating of, 1 to 5 on knowledge, skills, attitude, and habits. So if the child is, for example, completing homework every week, then it shows that the habit, there is a consistency, there is a, there is this maturity at the child's end, that they understand that they have to complete the homework. And if they're doing it week after week, what tends to happen is it shows that this is developed as a habit. Then how is it they're doing in terms of their homework? You look at knowledge and skills in that, and then obviously the attitude in terms of addressing those problems, taking on a challenge, are the bits that the teachers would be evaluating the child on. And in such cases, you would need to look at, documentation, communication with various stakeholders, and that tends to be the case for the need and agreeing the needs in terms of development of these resources for the learners. So most schools today have what is called, mathematics or some sort of software, which is again the use of technology to be able to set homeworks for children at home. So what they do study in the class, that is reinforced in terms of homework that they have to complete every week. And this could be different, in primary school or in the secondary school. And that tends to be around various subject areas that they are studying, like English, math, science, geography, history. And in the higher education side, this would be, equivalent to what is called self-study, which we recommend by asking learners to go through certain articles, journals, or certain chapters within the book for the content which has been covered in the class. Now, any questions on this, feel free to ask me through the chat room. The second assessment criteria talks about preparing resources for delivery and learning, which are meeting the needs of legislative and organizational requirements, and they tend to be in the case of looking at meeting some of the policy related aspects of health and safety, inclusion, equality and diversity, no discrimination. Those kind of things tend to be included. Now, when we look at this as an example, what we are considering in this case is predominantly, talking about, how do we go about taking into account some of these policies and procedures to ensure that, the resources that we develop are essentially fit for purpose. Now, when we do look at this aspect of, preparing the resources for delivery and for learning and development, what we are doing is we are taking into account the key aspects in the assessment criteria, which is one is legislative requirements, and they tend to be health and safety regulations, welfare and safeguarding policies, or in some cases, you would also look at policies like malpractice and plagiarism. You look at learner agreement or some sort of a policy which basically depicts what the expectation of learners are and what is the expectation, from the school or from the teaching institution. You'd also look at other policies like quality policy. You look at discrimination. You look at equality and diversity. You look at safeguarding in particular, which is nowadays mandatory. Is your staff having the CRB check if they're dealing with children under the age of 18? In such cases, these legislative requirements would need to be checked. Then you look at organizational requirements. So policy is essentially, legislative requirement would be off-call, awarding body, regulator requirements, and certain requirements which are put forward by the government in terms of teaching and learning. So, for example, prevent. When you look at female FGM, you look at awareness about equality and diversity, health and safety, safeguarding. They tend to be legislative requirement. When we come to organizational requirements, you're looking at policies and procedures that you are to follow as an educator, as a teacher. So look at equality, diversity policy, looking at making sure that your teaching is inclusive and it promotes inclusive teaching practices, which is making sure that you are engaging with learners, you understand the cultural background and the requirements, you are making sure that the examples or material which is being used is neutral, is not causing any discrimination towards any particular section or caste or society or learner coming from a different background. And in some cases, what you're ensuring is your material that you're putting together is conforming to the policies and requirements of the organization. Then you look at preparation of resources. You look at curriculum alignment. That means what is going to be taught, how is it going to be taught, is meeting is aligning with the curriculum requirements of a particular course. So Department for Education normally releases requirements, and when schools, colleges, or universities look at obviously picking that up, they need to ensure that they're meeting the requirements which are meeting the specific learning outcomes and ensuring that they are mapping those learning outcomes with appropriate resources to be able to teach to learners. Then we look at compliance and monitoring. Compliance and monitoring at the university level tends to happen with QA. For schools, it can be Ofsted, ISI. We look at other forms of compliance monitoring, which could be in the form of monitoring and development visits from awarding organizations. external examiner reports and checks which tend to happen throughout the course of the year in terms of ensuring that the teaching and learning process is fit for purpose, the resources being used for the purpose of delivering teaching and learning are adequate and meeting the requirements and needs of the learners. And then there are surprise checks or audits which are done also to ensure that policies are being put into practice, legislative and regulatory requirements are being met. Say, for example, if you're in a school, one of the things which would happen in, say, for example, a compliance audit visit would be to check, do we have disabled toilets? Do we have premises which is safe or considered safe, from a health and safety perspective? Do we have a good ratio in terms of student-teacher ratio within the classroom? Those are the kind of, things which would be picked up in compliance. And that would help us to understand how do we prepare resources for delivery of learning and development, thereby ensuring legislative, organizational policies, curriculum, and health and safety, and some of the quality policy side of requirements as far as this is concerned. So I hope this is understood. Any questions, feel free to ask. Now, the third assessment criteria is talks about planning to look at adaptation and to use of technology in which would help you in meeting the requirements of the learners. So in some cases, what we will also see is that sometimes when we look at, let's say, effective delivery. If I have to look at a teaching observation, and when we have to look at a teaching observation, we need to plan if the learning process is happening, is running well, and is the teaching effective in the class, or are the teachers or educators able to apply adaptations to make sure that they are making and meeting the needs of the learners. For example, in the class, in my class, for example, in strategic management, we have say 11 learners. Two of these learners are mature learners. Some of them, tend to be working as well, and some of them are currently unemployed. They are looking at reskilling by studying this particular qualification. Now, one of the learners has a disability. He has had, say, for example, a severe car accident a couple of months back, and he's recovering. And during this phase of recovery, now he's a bit better. So he has decided to enroll into the course and obviously study. Now, in such cases, what we are looking at doing is we are obviously ensuring that how do we make sure that the resources which are required for him to be accessing the course material are easily available, they are easily understandable by him, and they are useful for the purposes of gaining knowledge and skills. So one of the things that we have done is we have provided all the material on the course as a printed course material to him in a file, because sometimes when you're on the wheelchair, you're not able to be in front of the PC or use a device for a number of hours. So in such cases, having something which is printed out material also helps. So what we've done is provided a lot of these presentations, through the route of, printouts as a file. The second thing that we've done in terms of adaptation is the use technology. So what we've done is we've recorded a lot of lectures and specific tutorials on topics like the key frameworks and key models in a strategic management and leadership, and they have been made available to him through the use of YouTube and the Moodle infrastructure that we have, and that allows him to revise some of these key frameworks by looking into and listening into videos and watching these videos rather than go through the content of it in a study material basis like a printed material or an ebook. Now, in some cases, what we are also looking at meeting here is accessing the needs of the learner and looking at the capabilities in terms of how and what he can access at this stage because of the way he's, in the sense that he's recovering from an accident, and that allows him to, learn and makes his learning more effective. In our case, it allows us to integrate technology to meet his requirements and ensure that he has the availability of material, for the purposes of learning. Now, we are also looking at some stage, evaluating the requirements to say, okay, we have provided everything, but is it meeting the requirements? So what we do is we do regular surveys, and these regular surveys tend to be, course surveys or, feedback for, feedback surveys, which we do serve from time to time to our learners. And these surveys, when they are filled up by the learners, give direct feedback to the tutor. in terms of the course content, in terms of the delivery, in terms of engaging, learners on the course. Are they learning? Are they finding the learning interactive? And that side of things tends to be, done through the use of technology by using technology to provide and send out surveys, course surveys, exit interviews, and, feedback surveys related to the tutor. Now, the technology comes into play here as well because of the fact that the Moodle Hub, which is the infrastructure or a central repository for the purposes of teaching and learning, provides all the material, or exceptionally, I would say with the exception of, I wouldn't say all the material, but 95% of the material which is required for the study of that course. And then what we are doing at some stages, also continuously updating and updating the technology. That means updating the presentations, recorded lectures, resources which are there to ensure that they are up to date and they are effective for the purposes of learning, on that particular qualification. So when we look at the adaptations and how do we use technology which can help us in meeting the needs of the learning and development process for our learners, we are doing these things through the use of technology. It is, say for example, sending emails to the learners, is using a central calendaring app to inform them about the sessions which are scheduled, making available recorded sessions via Zoom or through social media in terms of YouTube, making sure that they're having access to presentations, documents, templates, articles, and journals, which is through the Moodle repository or Moodle. And apart from this, the live lectures that we are doing as of now, which is being done for this particular unit, is helping them to, is basically a way of using technology to help them look at learning and development. And this is what you would need to cover in this particular task. Any questions on this, please feel free to ask. Now, the next assessment criteria talks about, preparing the guidance or prepare guidance to assist those who use learning and development resources. Now, one of the things that we have to look at is sometimes when we do talk about preparing, resources for learning and development, what we have to do is essentially understand as a teacher, as a tutor, what is the resource going to be used for? Am I familiar with the resource? Am I familiar with the case study? Am I familiar with the book? Am I familiar with the presentation? Have I read it? Those are the bits that even the educators have to be, aware of and familiar with in terms of ensuring that before you provide this guidance to learners and assist them in the process of learning and development, have you gone through the bits in terms of familiarizing yourself with the resources? And these resources would then, over a point in time, allow you to understand why is this particularly required to be studied, or why is this particular activity required to be done in order to complete this learning objective. So you again go through the same basic steps of identify the learning goals, plan a schedule, create a learning schedule. You would then look at including supporting materials which could be, utilized by the learners. And these supporting materials would tend to be, looking at, say, assignments, quizzes, worksheets, exercises or activities that you would get in, ask the learners to do. And these would then all follow what is called the SMART goal objective, which is where you are ensuring that they are fit for purpose, but they're also specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time bound. So you're not doing an activity which is open-ended. You're not writing or asking them to write an essay which is, not having an in and out. That means defining the bounds in terms of this essays or this report is going to be a case study. It is going to be 3.5 to 4,000 words long. Would need to be submitted by such and such date. This is the evaluation criteria. This is the marking scheme. And this is the guideline through which it will be assessed. So all those bits have to be covered, when you look at preparing to assist learning, at the learners, at the students' end, at the children's end. And that is then supportive of the learning and development, process. And you are going to be falling back on what is called the resources. So obviously, in some cases, if I have a learner, just to give you a practical example, sometimes I have learners who come back and ask that, okay, I've gone through all the lectures, I've listened into the lectures, I've gone through the presentations, I've started to do my assignment, but I need a bit of help in this aspect of the course. That means they might get stuck where they are essentially, say, for example, writing an assignment. Now, in such cases, what they would do is ask for assistance that how do I go about writing the assignment? So in some cases, then what we do is we provide them an extract of a sample assignment for reference purposes, which has been submitted by another learner for them to be able to see. In my case, it is mature learners or adult learners with an average age of 40, 42. So in such cases, they're back to school for a number of reasons. And in such cases, for them to have a look at a feedback or a sample of that particular unit's assignment makes it helpful for them to understand that how they need to compile it, how they need to compile the evidence, then evidence it in the form of a written report or a case study as required. And that allows them to, complete that unit. So this particular guidance that we provide, information that we provide, which assists the learners in their process of learning and development by providing a sampler assignment, which is a resource, would be the aspect of how do you guide learners to be able to, guide the learners through the process of learning and development. I hope that's clear. Now, the last assessment criteria in this is evaluating the suitability of resources. Now, most important aspect is that whenever you are, teaching something and you're, obviously providing resources to your learners, one of the most important things that you have to look at is the suitability of resources. That means, are the resources fit for purpose? And this is a word or a phrase that I've used a couple of times in today's lecture, is because it is important for us to consider that the resources that we use, whether it's presentations, videos, handouts, journals, books, quizzes, whatever kind of activities, role plays, discussions that you do or activities that you do, are they going to help the learner understand the topic or the key reason why they are studying the unit, a particular unit or the course? How does it help them? And, do they understand this particular topic accurately or fairly well? That is what is to be evaluated when we look at suitability of resources. Now, if I'm teaching online and I just don't have a presentation or a slide to discuss or show some context, then the teaching online typically, just by verbatim or just like a bit of a dialogue in terms of discussions might not be enough for learners to achieve that particular unit. So in such cases, the suitability of resources in terms of what is written in the presentation, has that been verified? Is that the context which is written in the presentation, is that useful? Is the feedback being provided timely? There are lots of different parameters that you would consider in order to look at how this is going to make relevant use for the learner. That means, would they be able to grasp everything while you're having a discussion with the lecturer in the due course? And in some cases, what will happen is you'd be looking at falling back into understanding, again, going back to looking at initial assessments, diagnostics, learning style questionnaire, understanding your target audience, and then looking at tailoring your content in such a way that it is going to meet their requirements. It is going to make sense to them when they essentially, study that particular, material. Now, you would also, to a certain extent, explain the time commitments required to be able to study that course. Just in the morning, I had one learner asking me that how long do I need to study a particular unit? And I mentioned to them that, and how can he complete? So I mentioned to him that generally, if you do live lectures with us, you're looking at completing a unit in about 4 to 6 weeks. If you're self-studying, listening into recordings, presentations, you could probably take about 2 to 3 weeks to be able to complete a particular unit. But again, then that varies because there are different learners with different abilities to learn and different, contexts in terms of how they would learn. And that is where, I mentioned that technically speaking, you could complete a unit in about 4 to 6 weeks, but there could be learners who would take 4 to 6 months to complete a particular unit. But when we look at compliance and when we look at they studying a particular course with us for a particular reason, what we would generally say is if you study on your own and do self-study, you're looking at about 10 to 15 concentrated hours of reading and learning to be able to complete and achieve a unit. But if you study with us, we take a little bit of a balanced and a rational approach, and the learner will complete a unit in about 4 to 6 weeks. And that is where you're looking at the time frame in terms of making a decision whether this is correct. This is something which is related to making related to meeting the requirements of the learners, and that is where you will take regular feedback from learners and relevant bodies, for example, external examiner reports, Ofsted visits, to ensure that you're evaluating and taking feedback to ensure that the resources are effective, they are fit for purpose, they're suitable, their suitability over a point in time does not get diminished. And that is where you optimize these learning resources to help in the learning and development of learning and development process for the learners. So that is where I would suggest that you have to, essentially look at from a point of view of, evaluating the suitability of these resources. So quality part of it, the audit from a quality assurance part of it at the end of the year, when a program review is done, would essentially be looking at evaluating the suitability of these resources. Are the case studies fit for purpose? Is the presentation fit for purpose? That is something which the quality audit would decide when a program review is undertaken in universities, normally 3 years, in a awarding body case, normally about 5 years. And that review tends to look at whether the course material is accurate, reliable, up to date. Is it having trustworthy resources? Is it supported by evidence in terms of research? And is that course material accessible to all learners easily in the format in which they can easily understand it, navigate it, look through it, and obviously read to make sense and gain knowledge. And that part would be the part that you would look at when we talk about evaluating the suitability of resources, specifically for the purposes of learning and development. So I hope that this particular discussion on the learning outcome 2 has been helpful. And if you have any questions or feel that you need additional information, then my suggestion would be to head over to the plenary slide, and that is where what I'm going to do is obviously include, let's say, some articles, and I would say, links to certain articles which would allow you to understand and read them in a bit more detail, so that you get a full grasp of what is required to be able to develop resources for teaching and learning that meet the requirements of your learners. So I hope you have found this session useful, and I will catch up with you later, in the session. I think that session is tomorrow, to do a bit of discussion on the assignment in terms of how do you put together the evidence for this particular unit and submit the assignment to pass it. So until then, thanks for joining, and I'll see you next time.